Well, the autofocus on the X-H2s has really surprised me. So let's find out. Hey folks, so welcome to this video, and sorry I haven't been around for a while, but I've been on holiday and been very busy playing with the X-H2s, which I'm filming this on actually. So you wanted my first impressions of the camera, and I'm not going to go into details about everything on the camera. I've mainly been trying the photography side of the camera out, and I've got my notes to refer to down here so I don't get stuck. So one of the reasons, as a little bit of background, I traded an X-T5 and an X-S20 in. I wanted a camera that predominantly did everything. It did what the X-T5 did, it did what the X-S20 did. It could do video and it could do stills. And obviously, one of the things I've really struggled with bird photography, and which I'm going to go into first, is electronic shutter. Now, the 40 megapixel sensor on the X-T5 is wonderfully high resolution with 40 megapixels, but one of its Achilles heels is it's got a very slow readout. This means that if you use electronic shutter, you're going to really struggle to get an image that doesn't have what we call like rolling shutter. Now, rolling shutter isn't just a case of when something goes past, very fast in a certain direction. Rolling shutter can also be if a bird is taking off, it'll move its wings very quickly and they'll look very weird. I think I've got a sample I can bring up here, where the wings will sort of, well, they won't look right. They'll look sort of warped. You probably see from the picture I brought up there, that's an example of a sensor that has rolling, slow refresh. So its rolling shutter is quite high. Now, why would you want to use electronic shutter? Because you could use a mechanical shutter. Well, there's one feature that I've never really been able to use to great advantage on any of the Fuji cameras, which is what's called pre-burst. And pre-burst is useful if you want to anticipate something occurring. And I'm just going to bring a few samples of it as a talk, but I was predicting the sequence. I was watching this dragonfly over a wildlife pond fly around, and I'd worked out its path, and I sort of had the focus box in zone where it was going to come into the sort of frame. And of course I've got the back button focus set, so I'm always building up, so the camera's always got the buffer filled. So you've probably got about 100 pictures at least. I think it's got quite a decent buffer, the X-H2s. So as soon as you press the shutter, it dumps the buffer in. So even though you might react a second later and have missed the action, because the camera's been focusing and tracking the subject beforehand, you actually capture it. Now that only works with electronic shutter on Fuji systems. So, and it's something that I couldn't use on the X-T5 and even the X-S20. The X-S20 though is a lot more limited, although it could do 20 frames a second. It's not like the X-H2s. I think it can do up to 40 frames a second and no rolling shutter to speak of. And as you've probably seen from some of the examples I've got, and the dragonflies are not slow. They're pretty fast when they dart around like this. And this one was doing that. It was just suddenly taking off and darting across. And I've been able to freeze it and actually freeze it with a really sharply focused shot. And that has just blown my mind. And I know there are better cameras out there, but of the Fuji cameras, the X-H2s has come in for a lot of criticism. And now I've finally got to use one, 3 years after the release of the camera. I can say it's not perfect, but it's a hell of a lot better than the other Fuji cameras. And I've extensively used Fuji cameras since the X-T30. For the last 6 years I've owned them. So I can say I've got a lot of experience of Fuji autofocus systems. And this one, I've never seen anything like it. So that really covers, as you can see just from the sample shots, how accurate the autofocus was. Now, on about accuracy and tracking, I've mainly found that just using option 2 in the autofocus menu, which is just a standard mode for tracking, like fast moving objects like birds and insects, is pretty good. You can tweak it if you want a little bit, but to be honest, I found out the box it works pretty well. You can tend to put the zone switching on, it's on auto I think on that mode. The zone switching is where the camera focuses on things in the foreground or the background, and usually your subject is in the foreground. So I'm going to bring up some samples here where I did some bird photography. It's quite interesting where, again, these are common terns. They're like a big version of a house martin or a swift in their aerobatics and speed. Never before was I able to capture a bird in flight at this sharpness of focus, even coming towards me. I think on the X-T5 I probably captured one shot of a bird that was pretty sharp but not perfectly sharp, whereas the X-H2s is nailing it every single time. Again, electronic shutter, pre-burst, you're getting about a 60% keeper rate. I was throwing perfectly sharp pictures away because I was getting so many good ones, and there were a few that it missed. And where it gets confused, and I'll bring up a shot here where it actually was in focus, but you'll notice there's some trees in the background. It was getting confused where there were scenery in the background. If it's on a clear background, it was fine, and it was really nailing the focus. I mean, incredibly good focus. But when it was when there was detail in the background, I was finding the hit rate would drop quite a bit. It was still able to attain focus, but then if you look at a lot of cameras out, and I studied a lot of videos online of Nikon cameras and Sony cameras, and I sort of know how to do bird photography in flight. Was I doing something wrong? You know, was there a technique I wasn't using? I was thinking, because I've seen so much criticism of the Fuji cameras and how wonderful other systems are. And you know what I found? Most camera systems, when there's a busy background like trees, and there's not very much contrast between the subject and like a contrasty outline like you would get with blue sky, they were losing focus. Now, I'm not saying that it's as good as a Sony. It's not, from what I read, but I've never used a Sony, so I can't conclusively tell you that. All I can tell you is it's a darn sight better than an X-T5. And that sort of moves us on neatly to the next bit. We've seen how accurate the autofocus is, and if you use zone autofocus with the subject detect, you're going to get good results. Now, tracking, we may as well cover tracking before we move on to the image quality, because these are the two areas I want to focus on mainly. And we'll do a follow-up when I've learnt more about the camera. Only had it about a month, so there's been a lot to learn. So this is just first impressions of what I've done: wildlife photography and landscape photography, and a little bit of nighttime photography, which is interesting. But we'll come on to that at the end, and I'll show you some, not astrophotography, but I've done some photographs of the moon, which is very challenging scenes. But just finishing off tracking, the camera does support subject tracking. I've done videos before. You can link to, I'll link one of the videos I did with the X-H, I think I did some on the X-T5 and the X-S20. And to be honest, tracking performance is similar on all the X-Trans5 cameras. And what I mean by tracking is the tracking box, which is for tracking generic objects. You put the box and lock it onto a subject. And as long as it's moving slowly and in a predictable manner, the tracking works okay. But if you put the tracking box on a bird, it's going to struggle. It is. And that's one of the caveats of all Fuji systems, X-H2s included. I didn't really see a big improvement. But to be honest, I don't use tracking very much. I use zone autofocus, which is a lot of bird photographers do for birds in flight, because it's very hard to keep. There's the box, and you're getting the camera to do a lot of extra work. It's a lot easier to keep a zone over a bird in flight. So you put the zone over the bird in flight, and you rely on the camera to track the subject in the zone box. It's a bigger box, and the camera's a lot better at doing that. I think that's where people have come unstuck. They think they can use the tracking mode. And honestly, in all honesty, I'm not sure what the tracking mode is for. It's probably more for things like sports cars, but the subject detect is better than the tracking mode. I think the tracking mode is kind of a catch-all. So if the subject, if there isn't, say you want, I don't know, say you wanted to track, you were at a bowling alley and you wanted to track the bowling ball going towards you with side on. There isn't really a subject mode for bowling balls, but you could put the tracking on and you could try and, if you wanted to track it, you could track something with that. It's for tracking things that are not picked up by the subject detect. And they tend to be slower anyway. So you were doing, you were sort of doing a dolly shot on an object. You might put the tracking box over it because it might be more accurate to track it like that if it's moving than it is to use the zone autofocus. So correct autofocus mode for the correct type of photography you do. If you're doing birds in flight or indeed birds on a stick, you're going to use zone with subject. If the bird is in quite dense foliage, you're probably going to drop to single point autofocus, because then you can get the camera to ignore the foliage around. Now, while I've talked about that, I've got a little bit of just a little bit of footage where I did some quick tests of. I went to Look Nature Reserve and I tested the video autofocus in default settings with this, what I've been talking about, zone and subject detect, and it wasn't too bad at keeping the things in focus. I was testing out the slow motion. Bearing in mind I hadn't got to grips fully with the camera then, it was very early on, I just got it, and I think I made some mistakes. I just wanted to bring a little bit up there because this is my first impressions of using it. I think there's room for improvement in not what the camera can do, but my technique on doing that. Now, and I haven't got any samples, direct samples to show you. I've done one model shoot with this, but I can't show you the pictures for confidentiality reasons, so you'll have to trust me. But the model shoot I did, the eye autofocus, this is the big one, and we're doing eye autofocus here, so I've deliberately set a sort of moody low light scene, so I haven't seen this, I won't be able to evaluate this until the end, so you can see what the video autofocus is like with me in relatively low light, and is it losing autofocus on the eye or not. But getting back to the point of the eye autofocus on the subject, is it better than the X-T5? Yes, it is. Is it perfect? No, it's not. It's worse than bird photography. I don't mean that in a bad way, but it would sometimes say it had got the eye, but it would be soft focus. But not as bad as the X-T5, which was doing this horrendous back focusing, where it would just completely, it was really bad. And I was comparing the latest firmware on the X-T5, and you've seen my videos on the X-T5. I've done videos on the X-T5 on the latest autofocus firmware. So you can just go through my videos and you can see that. I'll see if I can remember to link that video too, where I did the one about video autofocus from another model shoot I did. So as much as I can't give you a sample this time, it's a lot better. And I was using the old XF 56mm, the old original non-weatherproof one, which is not particularly a sharp lens to start with by today's standards. It's more characterful. So it did miss the odd shot, which I didn't want it to do, but I got most shots I wanted, and I would trust it a lot more than an X-T5 in a professional environment. Is there room for improvement? Probably. But I need to try different lenses. I need to try lenses that have got a more accurate autofocus system, because I was using it on a lens I've had since 2018. I won't part with a 56mm. I've considered selling it numerous times, but it's such a characterful lens. I love it. But you have to put up with its quirks. It's a bit pants when it comes to autofocus. It's an old lens. It was designed way before the X-H2s, so maybe I'm being a bit harsh. So I need to look at getting... I've got a 40-150 and I do use that sometimes, but I prefer primes for portrait shoots because a zoom gives you too many options, but that's for another video. So the jury's a little bit out on that, but that's just, again, it's my first impressions. I wish I could show you a sample, but I can't. But bearing in mind that I was overall impressed, I got some fantastic shots, which I really like, from the camera. So we've covered all of those initial things. Now, what I wanted to go into, one of the advantages of the stacked sensor is the alleged advantage of low light performance. And we're going to look at this in two areas. We're going to do a continuation of the bird photography, and then we're going to look at some landscapes I did, and what the noise is like in sort of night shots, like I say, astro shots. They were sort of moon shots, where I was trying to get the supermoon, not the supermoon, there is a supermoon next month, the different full moon phases of the month. They're named every month. The one this month in August was a sturgeon moon, and that's the one we'll be looking at. So, and I've got a few shots from last month. And noise is subjective because it's not really the camera's fault, but we'll come to that. So let's just finish off on bird photography at the minute. Now, one of the areas where the X-T5, and I'll see if I can bring a sample up of the X-T5, is that you might think you've got a sharp image, but it might be that the shooting conditions were not optimal. And then you zoom in on the eye and it's a little bit soft and it's a little bit muddy and there's not a lot of detail there. Now, in shadows, you don't get detail where there isn't light. But pixel density plays its part, and when you use a 26 megapixel stacked sensor versus a 40 megapixel, you do see the difference. And because the light gathering is arguably better per photo site, because the pixel density is able to gather more light for this, because the surface area of the pixels are different. I'll not go into the technical details. I've read a lot about this, and generally that's why full frame cameras are seen as better in low light, because they've got a lower pixel density. A 24, that's why S5 II is my go-to astro camera, because it's 24 megapixels and it's full frame, and it's about a stop better. It was a stop and a half better than the X-T5. I'd probably say it's about a stop, not quite a stop, between it and the X-H2s. It is better, the X-H2s. And we can see that some of the shots, as I bring some samples up here, the noise in them isn't too bad. And you've seen from the X-T5 shot that there's more noise, it's softer focus. But the crucial thing is, and I'll bring this picture of before, I had a picture of a kingfisher. And then I thought, oh, that's underexposed. The light went when I took the picture, but it was only one I caught. Let's brighten it up. And I was pretty gobsmacked by the detail. The camera had exposed correctly, but it had actually exposed and it had got the picture sharp. And I've repeated this a few times and thought it's actually able to get the focus quite sharp, or very sharp, acceptably sharp, even when the subject is in shadow. This is one thing the X-T5 and the X-S20 couldn't do. So it does have certain advantages. It's not capturing more detail. I think it can just gather a little bit more clarity because of it's got, you know, slightly better light gathering. And obviously the stacked sensors are supposed to be a little bit better. Maybe this readout speed helps. I'm not sure of the technicality, but all I can tell you is that the end result was better. It just was. And I've got some bird photography shots that I could not have got as easily with the X-T5. It would have been more luck, that it just happened to press the trigger when it was on that focus. And also, I think if you shoot to the lighting conditions that suit the camera, you can get a great shot. But it just means I've got the capability to get that shot in more challenging lighting conditions. So let's go to look at the noise in these night landscapes. Now obviously in these ranges you've got to expose for the brightest objects in the sky unless you're doing exposure bracketing, which I don't really have a sturdy enough tripod to do. The moon tends to move, so it's a bit more challenging, and then you've got to do some quite advanced techniques too. So I try and do it in one exposure, because otherwise you're playing around with Photoshop, doing composites and all sorts of stuff. So what you'll find is that because you're just exposing, say, 1/100th of a second, there's a lot of noise in the shadows. And if you did the same shot on a full frame camera, there'd be a stop less noise. So you've got to do a lot of cleanup. That's not to say you can't do that shooting. You can. And there's not a lot of difference here between the X-T5, the X-S20 and this camera. It's going to perform slightly better, but not substantially. And it's not going to be anywhere, it's not really that close to a full frame camera in low light photography. I've done astrophotography with my S5 II and its noise performance is far better. Now, that being said, when you're shooting things like Milky Way, because you can leave the shutter open for longer, noise becomes less of a problem. So let's say I take a stacked shot of the Milky Way and I take 10 exposures, I might find that I could do it in 8 exposures on a full frame camera and get a similar result. Because it's if you do 10 exposures at 30 seconds, for argument's sake, that's 300 seconds, not 30 seconds. Because each exposure is then stacked and the noise is averaged out and removed, and that applies to a cropped sensor or a full frame sensor. Overall per frame, the full frame sensor is slightly less noisy per image, but it's diminishing returns as you let more light in. So from that aspect, noise performance is what I would expect of this camera, and it's less, I thought it would be better, but it is a cropped sensor and it's acceptable, I would say. But I think I would still use a full frame camera, but I'm going to try this for astrophotography, absolutely. I want to use it for that, but the dark skies have only just appeared and the weather hasn't been playing ball in the UK at the minute. So, as you can see from the samples I've shown, you're getting better performance in wildlife photography in shadows, but ultimately, with every camera, you've got to shoot with it in optimal conditions. You push it to suboptimal conditions, you're going to get suboptimal results. It's as simple as that. And me included, I've been critical in the past over things, I'm sure, on cameras when I've done videos before, probably. But as I've learned, I've like, yeah, you've got to do that. But when I knew there was a camera out there that could do better than the cameras I had, and could do it in one camera versus having two, I decided that with the camera being on sale, it was worth doing that. Now, are there any criticisms of the camera from my early thoughts? And yes, there are. So I've written a few of them down here. I do wish that the zebras could be used in stills mode, like I can on my X-H2 and my S5 IIX, and lots of other cameras do support zebras in stills mode. You can just use them in video. It would be nice if there were 2 levels, so you can set underexposed and overexposed zebras, if you like. So Fuji, can we have those? Blinking highlights, of course, are there. And it would be nice to have waveforms or a vector scope, but we'll have to do with a histogram for now. Nothing we can do about that. Custom mode buttons. The X-T5 has 8 custom modes, but the way they're assigned is annoying at best. It would be nice if you could assign a custom button which flipped it to where you could have it in the mode where you could custom have 6 modes on stills and 2 modes on video, but it would be nice if I could have all 8 on video or all 8 on stills and flick it at the flick of a switch. See, with the S5 IIX, I've got, I think, 12 custom modes, and it's enough to have everything I need But when you've got 8 and then you have to restrict, say, 5 of them to stills and 3 to video, it's not enough to have everything programmed in. So, and on the X-T5, you could press a button and open all the custom modes, and then it would be, because there was a mode switch between video and stills, it would bring up 8 for stills and 8 for video. So it seems rather odd that on their flagship camera, they've kind of restricted it. You do sort of have 16, but it's the clumsy implementation. It would be much easier just to have a mode switch that flipped them from video mode to stills mode, so that you can quickly just put the camera in video mode and then have all 8, and then put it in stills mode and have them in all for stills. The X-T5 does that as its photocentric camera. That was odd. That was surprised me. Sometimes you can't assign custom modes to things you would want to, like quickly getting to the custom modes. And I think that's because they've put a custom mode dial on. But I suppose that's because the X-T5 doesn't have that, so it has a custom button. And the only other thing was the way that the exposure compensation worked. Now, there's another video I'm going to link in this because it's the same as the X-S20. So, if you go back to the X-H, and a lot of people don't understand this, so you've got to watch the video that I've done on this. If you go back to an X-H1, it had an exposure compensation dial. And if you have an X-H2 or 2S, they don't have that. So you have to assign it to a button on the touchscreen, which is fine. But if I turn the exposure compensation dial on an X-T5 and I set it to +1, and the camera is showing it's +1 and +2 EV as the exposure, I still know that I've dialed in one stop of that because it's on the dial and I can see it. But the camera obviously is showing me the actual exposure. It's showing me what it can see plus what I've added. And in the heat of the moment, it's very easy to forget that. So you can glance at the dial and go, oh yeah, I've dialed in +1. And you could do that on the X-H1, but on the X-H2 and the X-S20 and all of their PASM cameras, you can't do that. Because it doesn't show you the setting, it shows you the exposure. And what I need to see is the exposure and what I've got the dial turned to. A virtual dial, if you like. Which they could do because the GFX cameras have virtual dials on the top screen. And that would be a lovely feature to have. So that's a couple of criticisms. So there's a lot of videos in the description for you to have a look at. But overall, I am very impressed with the camera. I've got a lot more to learn about it. I really haven't done much in the way of video other than a little bit of the slow motion. I literally just turned it on and recorded. I can't even remember what mode I had it in. I don't even know if I had it in log. That the samples that you've seen of some birds sitting on twigs and things. But as you can see, you know, from the shots I brought up of the turn in flight, just wow. It's substantially improved over the other cameras, and anybody contemplating getting one of these cameras for wildlife, they are better for that. They've got a few quirks to put up with that I've gone over, and I hope Fuji do bring some quality of life things. A lot of these things I've suggested, like I think the vector scopes and things like that, are already on the GFX series, shutter angle, things like that. I think the GFX has them, and these are things that the S5 has, Sony cameras have, and they're not difficult to add, they're just a bit of firmware update, and it will be lovely. It's a video focus camera that can do stills. Give it the features, because shutter angle is just, it's so good to have, because it means that if I'm doing slow motion and I set the shutter to 180, I know I'm at the right shutter speed. I don't have to go and just calculate, is it 1/240th? No, 1/250th. You see, you get the point. I don't have to think, I just go, oh yeah, 180. That's it set, and that's why you have shutter angle, because it's dead easy to do. I'm shooting 100 frames a second, 180. And shutter angle is just so that, you know, when I do this, if you pause this video, my hand should be blurred. If you record that kind of movement on an action camera and pause it, it won't be blurred, it'll be freeze frame because of the way action cameras work for the stabilisation. And generally when you're doing filmmaking, you don't want to have this solid, clinical, you want a bit of motion blur. So that's why it's an important feature to have. But I digress. I'm very impressed with the camera. I'm looking forward to trying more lenses on it. I haven't even had a chance to do that. And I've barely touched on all the other features of it. And I think let's summarise with a few of the quick features. The viewfinder, you do notice the difference, not hugely, but you do notice it. 5.7 million dots. I'm going to do another video on viewfinders. They're a bit misleading. I definitely noticed that as an improvement. The screen, I love an articulating screen, and it's lovely to go back to having that. It's slightly lower res than the other cameras, but you don't notice it. Lovely grip. Battery life is, again, superb. I love the top display, which shows my battery level, how many shots I've got left, memory card that's active. I love the fact that I've got an endless buffer if I want, because I've got the new Compact Flash Express cards, which are just insanely fast. Very expensive though. And I would like USB recording so I can plug an SSD in. Come on, Fuji. I hear the X-T5 is supposed to have that, and the GFX does, so that's another thing I like to have. So that just about sums up the good points and the bad points about the camera. If you're in the market for one and you get one in the sale, what I did, £1,700, ex-demo camera, full 2-year warranty, can't complain. It was a great price, and that camera, the camera's gone up in recently, I think it's about 2.7 now. It's, considering its age, brilliant camera, virtually no rolling shutter, absolutely loving it despite its problems. I really, really hope Fuji bring these quality of life things, some features down from the GFX before they bring out a new model. But if the new model builds on this one, I know what my next camera would be in the future. This has made a lot of difference to my photography. And as much as some people say it's not about gear, sometimes it is. I'm sure that the skill plays a big part in photography, absolutely. But if you had a racing driver, and I'm going to use an analogy to wrap up from Top Gear. And there was a racing driver who was on Top Gear, sadly she's passed away now, called Sabine Schmidt, the German lady. And she challenged Jeremy Clarkson to race a racing car, sports car, around the Nürburgring. And you know, she nearly did it because she's far more skilled than he is as a driver. So she almost made up for it in a van versus a sports car. But she couldn't quite. So in other words, an advanced camera is always going to have the edge over a more basic camera, like an entry-level one. And a good photographer might be able to get a basic camera very close to what you can do with an advanced camera. But somebody less skilled, like myself, I'm not the best photographer in the world, I'm okay. Well, the technology does help me, and I appreciate it. So it's a balance. But if you disagree, why not discuss that in the comments? What a lovely controversial topic to end on. Do I have gas or not? Gear acquisition syndrome, what were you thinking? I'll catch you all later, folks. Bye.